Hello and welcome to the CX Files podcast. I'm your host, Mark Hillary. This week I'm speaking to Mike Havard, Director of the Ember Group. Ember Group is a customer engagement and CX professional service business based in the UK. Basically, they help brands to build and manage CX strategies. I heard Mike speak a few months back on the subject of champion service brands, and I wanted to ask him about this in more detail. So I called him during a visit to Canada, and he fought off the seagulls long enough for us to have a conversation. Mike is also a speaker at the forthcoming CX Outsourcers event taking place on March 25th and 26th in Windsor, UK. So if you want to meet Mike and hear him speaking about CX strategy, then Google CX Outsourcers for more information or check the link in the podcast description. Okay, so when I asked you to, if you could appear on the podcast, I said to you, what are you talking to a lot of customers of yours about at the moment? And you mentioned champion service brands. So what exactly do you mean? I mean, could you maybe explain what that means?
Yeah, it's something that we've seen more and more organisations talking about in recent years, where with the rise of league tables and much more data and awareness for the consumer about how various brands seem to be performing in terms of the service levels they give and how they're perceived, it's becoming an issue that's higher up the agenda for chief execs and service directors and operations people about how they can become more famous, have a better reputation for service delivery, so that they can be seen in these rankings, but also importantly do the right thing for their customers and ensure that therefore there's this virtuous circle of doing the right thing, getting a reputation for it, and that reputation driving more customers and better business. And I suppose the underlying question to this issue is one of, is it worth it? That's the sort of fundamental question of, is it worth being a champion brand? And what we've looked at in terms of the economics of this is yes, it is. It doesn't necessarily mean you need to be world class and at the Ritz-Carlton end of service delivery. There is a place on a spectrum that is right for an organisation's brand to be positioned in terms of its service and its service reputation, and doing that economics is a really important thing, but there is definitely value in having a lower cost to serve, in having more satisfied customers that are prepared to overlook the occasional inadequacy in your delivery, or the occasional straying of your usual high levels of performance. There's also value in, particularly for service directors and operations leaders, keeping the CEO off your back by having a clear and known reputation. And the final thing, Mark, I'd say on this whole issue of what it means to be a service champion brand is that it's not actually just about the service delivery that you give. It's clearly important. You have to do your best to try and live up to the reputation that you want to have. But it is also about your positioning and your proposition. So that's very much playing to the marketing agenda about how you want to be perceived, how competitive you want to be, what positioning you want versus your industry peers. And I think this therefore creates a much bigger opportunity overall for the world of service delivery to, for the first time, really have an agenda that joins up the service operations and the marketing folks within a business, because they've for far too long been operating in silos. And the idea of creating a champion service brand has to be coordinated and aligned between those parties.
Okay, and so are we seeing this driven partly by customer expectations crossing from one industry to another? For example, are we expecting our water company to improve their customer service because of the experience we have with Amazon?
That's always been the case. I don't think there's anything new in that idea. I have a relationship with a bank. I don't know how to compare my bank with others because I have the relationship with just that one bank. But what I do know is what my experience with Amazon is like, and what my experience with my utility is like, and what my experience in John Lewis and Marks and Spencer's is like. So I think that's always been the case. What we have is more data about that now, but we also have increasingly robust, benchmarks about how organizations within the same industry perform, which have been doing this for a few years. The Institute of Customer Service produces some very good league tables for the UK. There are other global benchmarking tables that start to provide good and very interesting data. And to be honest, there isn't a lot of surprise within those. What is interesting within it is just how much, to my previous point, marketing and the promise of the brand is, I think, much more important than people realize, rather than just the actual service delivery. You constantly see at the top of these tables people like Nationwide, John Lewis, Marks and Spencer's, First Direct, and I think there is as much about the story they tell and how they align all of their messages around their service promise as much as it is about the actual customer service delivery of those brands.
Yeah, and that's interesting, because I guess that's one of the big differences between customer service and customer experience. Is when we talk about the overall experience, then it's sales, marketing, service, it's every single interaction. So what are the champion brands doing that actually sets them apart there then?
I think they're being really clear about the promise and the position that they want to have. So, this will potentially, agitate a lot of people, but I think that someone like Ryanair has got it right in that they're not setting out to be world class in terms of service level and the quality of interaction when you have an issue and need to complain. But what they do is set a very clear expectation for the level of service that you're likely to get and have a price point that matches it. So the whole business is aligned around their service proposition, and therefore they create the best value for their stakeholders. And that I think is the true definition of a champion service brand, is one that's got the right position on the spectrum that creates the most value for the organization and for the customers. And I think, therefore Ryanair is at the functional end rather than the brilliant end of service, but that seems to be the right place for them. And when they do occasionally cock it up, they recover quickly, they're very agile, they're very flexible, they're very focused on recovery. And so, I think that it's not just about these brands that have the reputation for brilliance. It can also be about brands that just have a reputation for being functional and good enough. And I think that, that's one of the more recent learnings that we've picked up from working across the spectrum of organizations across all sectors, that where you need to be in terms of your proposition is on a spectrum. It's not a point.
Mm-hmm. Okay, could you mention maybe some of the companies you've worked with, or perhaps just other examples of brands that were perhaps mediocre or failing even, and then really stepped up their game by recognizing the value of CX?
Yeah, really good question. I think that a good example of that is someone like Nationwide Building Society that set out to use the league tables as a way of motivating and aligning its organization around improvement and getting to where it needs to be. And they set out to say, we want to be number one in the retail banking service experience. And they did a whole load of work around the end-to-end customer journey, the customer experience, how they differentiate, how they align their marketing with their operational capabilities, to how they align it with the in-branch experience. So, and they have made clear strides over the last 10 years in delivering on that program. And another example is, which I think is a great example, is someone like Lego that we've worked with through the years. And I think they've asked us one of the best questions that, any client has ever asked us, which is, as a premium brand delivering very high service levels with great people, great technology capabilities, really thinking hard about digital customer experiences and creating really valuable moments that matter for their consumers. The question was, is it worth it? Should we just pare it back and be functional, save a lot of money, and create more value for our shareholders? Or by doing that, do we put value at risk? Now, I can't tell you what the answer is, but from a position of strength, I think that was a brilliant question to be asking.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's an interesting point then, because you can say obviously it's a great thing to be offering a fantastic customer experience, but if it's costing so much that you can't justify that kind of budget, then how does a CEO determine exactly how much is necessary to satisfy the customer?
Yeah, and that's a great question, and it's right at the heart of everything we do in Ember, which is, helping clients understand the economics of service. That's got to be the starting point, because you're not going to drive the investment that you need to do the right thing for your customers if you don't understand the economics. If you don't know the value that better service levels generate, or, an enhanced digital customer journey will create in terms of extra spend or loyalty or advocacy or tenure of the customer or retention of the customer, whatever it is. If you don't understand that, then how can you justify the investment that's needed to get there? So, the economics are really important. And there's two parts to the economics. One is the calculation, what's, the lifetime value and the implications of poor service to, the bottom line or the balance sheet or whatever it is. What's the upside that you might get from improved service or better service or more competitive service versus your peers? So there's very hard numbers that should, be worked through. That can be quite difficult. There can be, a lot of modeling and assumptions and proxies in that, but it can be done. It should be done. And the second issue is, how do you translate that into the language that the board buys into and makes the necessary commitments? So, you've got to speak the language of the boardroom. You've got to talk in terms of P&L and balance sheet and risk impact in confident terms with the models and the numbers to sort of substantiate it, rather than wallowing in the operational language that we've often seen, where people talk about very credible, good, worthy stuff like CSAT and NPS and ESAT and service levels and all these other things, but that doesn't get the attention and the commitment of the board to spend the millions of pounds that's often necessary. So you've got to translate your world, the operational or the service or the marketing world, into the language of the boardroom so that you can do the right thing for your customers. Okay. And that's where champion brands, I think, really stand apart. They've done the maths, they've got the economics worked through, they know where they should be investing, but where they don't need to overinvest. And then they get the board aligned to that. And then once you've got the funding, it then becomes a question of leadership, because it's not just about the money, but you've got to start there. And then it's about the leadership to see it through. And going back to my Nationwide example, that was what they did extremely well, was, strong leadership and aligning all parts of the business to deliver on that opportunity.
Mm-hmm. Okay, that's fantastic. I know that you're speaking at a conference, the CX Outsourcers Conference, next month in Windsor in the UK. And I saw that you're doing a keynote all about the Brexit effect on the UK and European CX. So is there any chance you could just give us a few words about what you're going to be speaking about?
Yeah, it's really looking forward to it, actually, Mark, and it's delighted to have been invited to speak at it. Somewhat of a slightly poisoned chalice at this point in time, talking about Brexit when there's probably been an overload of that for many people. But I think it's a really important issue in that, how does the CX vendor community treat Brexit either as an opportunity or to understand the risks involved? And I think the key point of my message is one of, how do you deal with uncertainty? And, that's not just uncertainty in your own business as a service provider, but it's how do you play to and support the challenge and the agenda of the client community that will be feeling a lot of uncertainty, a lot of pain, a lot of lack of investment, a lack of long-term thinking, which will then mean, how do they become more agile? How do they get more flexibility into their balance sheet? How do they mitigate the risks of fixed costs and issues running out of control in a post-Brexit world, whatever that looks like. So it's really getting the vendor community, the customer management outsourcers and the BPO providers to think about how that messaging needs to adapt to a strategic business issue of uncertainty. And it's a classic issue. Whenever you get a period of uncertainty in the economic cycle, whether that's through economic downturn or through general elections, for example, or referenda, or whatever it might be, whenever there is that period of uncertainty, performances cyclical downturns. And so the question is for the outsourcing community, how do they help their clients and their prospects address that uncertainty issue? And that's their strategic opportunity through a Brexit period, I think.
Thanks for listening to the CX Files podcast. Please take a moment to review the podcast because this helps other listeners to find it. And if you have any suggestions, then get in touch with me on Twitter or LinkedIn. I'm at Mark Hillary with 2 L's, or just search Google for Mark Hillary.